On the evening of April 13th, 1945, a solitary plane traversed the Japanese Sea. Originating in Tokyo, amidst Japan's failing war in the Pacific, this aircraft wasn't loaded with bombs or soldiers. It carried a foreign diplomat, the Swedish envoy to Japan, Widar Bagge. This flight bore a heavy significance for Stockholm's top representative in East Asia. For one, it marked an emotional farewell after over a decade of service in Tokyo, where he had seen both Japan's brightest achievements and its darkest moments. He remembered the prosperous Japan of the 1920s, a cooperative member of the League of Nations, a supporter of internationalism, and a welcoming nation for foreign collaboration. Yet he also witnessed the darker transformation of Japan, with its waves of violence and xenophobia, where fanatics drove a militarized society, assassinating leaders and conquering lands for the empire's supposed rightful dominance in Asia. When the bombs began to fall, he watched the gradual devastation of a country he cherished. Bagge's departure was indeed a solitary one, as no other diplomat or foreign civilian could dream of escaping Japan at such a late stage in the war. He was lifted to Manchuli, a northern town in Manchuria under Japanese control, close to the Soviet Union. From there, he could board the Trans-Siberian Railway that would lead him to Moscow and then on to Stockholm. This flight was a rare privilege, granted to him due to important connections with the empire's high-ranking officials and a unique mission to seek a negotiated peace between Japan and the United States. Although the Bagge maneuver, or Bagge peace feeler, ultimately failed, it encapsulates a crucial theme of this book. Sweden, a nation that held no allegiance to the empire nor enmity towards it, played a role in events that would influence Asia and the Pacific for generations. Throughout World War II, Sweden maintained its neutrality, which did not hinder its diplomatic efforts. Rather, this neutral stance enabled Sweden to remain actively engaged in global diplomacy. Not only could Bagge depart Japan during these uncertain times, but he was also approached by peace-minded Japanese, seeking assistance in one of the darkest periods, a situation that only a few countries were still in a position to navigate. Only Switzerland and Spain found themselves in a similar situation. This book shares Sweden's narrative. Sweden's experience during World War II differed greatly from that of many other countries. While much of the world was engulfed in total war, Sweden escaped that violent fate by staying out of the conflict. It declared its neutrality towards the various fronts, committing to not take sides in line with international law. There's a common misconception that a neutral state must completely cut off contact with warring nations, and that economic or political interactions violate strict neutrality. This is simply not true. In fact, the law of neutrality, part of international law, affirms that neutral nations have the right to trade and engage with warring states. Sweden exemplified this during World War II, maintaining normal diplomatic and economic relations with both the Allies and Axis powers, including Japan. However, there's something peculiar about Sweden's wartime diplomacy with Japan. Despite significant ideological differences and Sweden's strong condemnation of Japan's aggressive actions, first in China and then in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the diplomatic relationship between the two countries not only remained intact, but grew stronger over time. For instance, the Swedish legation in Tokyo expanded from 3 members in the late 1930s to over 20 by 1945. Communications from Bagge to the foreign ministry soared from just 1 or 2 telegrams a week to multiple messages every day. While Stockholm initially hosted only a handful of Japanese diplomats, 5 in 1931 and 1 in 1941, by the time Tokyo surrendered, 55 were supporting the Japanese mission. As the war dragged on, Japan began to deepen its diplomatic relationship with the one remaining Nordic neutral. What makes this situation even more surprising is that trade between the two nations plummeted simultaneously. In 1937, the peak year for bilateral trade, Sweden imported goods worth over 12 million crowns from Japan, but by 1945, that number had dropped to less than 300,000 crowns. How can we make sense of the connection between the militaristic Japan and the neutral democratic Sweden, especially when trade, one of Sweden's key interests in Japan, fell off so sharply? Was the bond between the two countries built on genuine friendship, or were their interactions shaped more by the demands of the time? Was there something darker at play, a less savory part of Sweden's history? After the revelations in the 1990s regarding the collaboration of neutral countries with Nazi Germany, Sweden faced significant criticism for its ties with the Axis powers. In 1991, Swedish journalist Maria-Pia Boethius released a provocative book called Heder och Samvete, which emotionally critiqued Sweden's foreign policy during the war, sparking years of reflection. This debate centered on whether Sweden's appeasement of Nazi Germany aimed to prevent invasion, or if the nation, like other neutral countries, chose to align itself with Hitler purely for profit. Should we expect to see a similar pattern in Sweden's dealings with Japan, the easternmost Axis power? The straightforward answer is no. Our book contends that the Swedish-Japanese relationship offers fresh insights into neutral wartime diplomacy because traditional World War II perspectives don't apply here. Questions about whether Sweden collaborated with Japan for security or commercial purposes are largely irrelevant. Analyzing Sweden's interactions with Japan doesn't need the same existential lens used for its relations with European nations. Militarily, Sweden had no reason to fear Japan. The countries were separated by a continent, and while Sweden may have entered into unequal treaties with Japan and China during its semi-colonial past, it didn't have the same overseas territorial ambitions as Britain, the Netherlands, or the United States. Under any reasonable scenario, Japan could not have posed a security threat to Stockholm. Conversely, in Europe, Sweden faced serious challenges. Germany, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union all posed risks to Swedish security. Warring nations often disregarded the rights of neutral countries when it served their military objectives, as evidenced by Nazi Germany's occupation of neutral Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium, alongside the Soviet Union's attack on the neutral Finns and annexation of the neutral Baltic states. The British invaded neutral Iceland and Iran, while their allies in the Pacific targeted the neutral Portuguese colony of Timor. This left the Swedish government justifiably concerned about an invasion from neighboring countries, though Japan did not pose the same threat. Economically, Sweden's reliance on trade with warring European nations created a notable weakness in negotiations, while its trade with Japan was relatively minimal. By 1938, less than 1% of Sweden's imports came from Japan, and only 4% of its exports went there. Although Japan was Sweden's largest trading partner in Asia, it did not compare in significance to its aggressive neighbors, from which Sweden sourced 21% of its imports from Germany, 16% from the United States, and 12% from Britain. Despite these unimpressive trade figures, it is significant that diplomatic and trade relations with Japan continued throughout the war. This book argues that Sweden maintained trade with Japan even while vocally opposing its unlawful expansion. Given the precarious situation in Europe, it is curious that Sweden did not recall its diplomats and expatriates after Japan joined the war against the Allies, especially considering the growing hostility of the empire towards European foreigners. In August 1940, long before the Pacific War began, a Reuters journalist named M.J. Cox died during police questioning after falling from a building. While Japanese military police labeled it a suicide, many in the international community suspected foul play. Another British national, Frederick Ringer, who was the Swedish consul in Nagasaki, also died in detention that year, prompting even long-term European residents to leave Japan. As the international tension escalated, Japanese military oppression against foreign nationals intensified. Journalist Widar Baggi noted that the possibility of Japan's entry into the war carries special risks for its white inhabitants given the rising xenophobia. So, why persist with engagement? Stockholm could have evacuated around 100 expatriates, even after Pearl Harbor, but the decision was made not to do so. This book delves into the history behind Stockholm's choice to maintain its connection with Japan, starting from its initial missteps in Manchuria all the way to the tragic conclusion after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What drove this decision? Who were the key players, and how did economic, political, and diplomatic factors intersect? In essence, why and how did Sweden engage with Japan during this wartime era? To uncover the answers, we examine four facets of Swedish-Japanese relations. First, the international backdrop in which both nations operated. Next, the national political discussions in the Riksdag, the government, and the popular media, including newspapers, books, and magazines. Then we look at economic ties as reflected in trade statistics, reports, and telegrams. Lastly, we explore the diplomatic exchanges based on original documents. Some stories discussed in this book have been previously examined by historians, but much of the material draws on fresh sources from Swedish and Japanese archives. Together, these documents narrate the relationship between Scandinavia's last neutral state during the war and a distant combatant. Sweden's commitment to neutrality in World War II cannot be overstated. Unlike the turmoil faced by many countries across Europe, North America, and Asia, Sweden had no formal enemies. On a diplomatic level, Stockholm treated Japan, China, the USSR, Germany, and the United States equally. It fostered friendly relations with all, yet this posed a challenge, as Sweden's friends were engaged in conflict, leading to pressures from every direction. Supporting one side almost always resulted in backlash from the other. This predicament was aptly captured by Östen Undén, a notable Swedish diplomat, who once conceded that while this reality might need to be accepted, those who advocated for neutrality wouldn't be celebrated as the saviors of humanity. Neutrals could hardly expect much sympathy from either side for their lack of support. The situation was even more dire, with little hope that warring nations would honor the rights of neutral countries out of respect for international law, and no systems in place to ensure these rights. The League of Nations had been ineffective ever since it failed to act against Japan's aggression in China in 1931 and completely fell apart following Italy's invasion of Abyssinia in 1936. The law of neutrality, which had evolved over the centuries and was formalized during the Hague Conventions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, served merely as guidelines for neutral states, lacking any guarantees against aggression. The Swedish government was acutely aware of the precarious position they were in. In April 1939, Erik Boheman, the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs, drafted a note approved by Foreign Minister Rickard Sandler and shared with Sweden's top foreign policymakers, including Prime Minister Per Albin Hansson. This note outlined a practical approach to neutrality in the event of another war in Europe, emphasizing that there was little reason to think belligerents would respect the rights of neutral countries any better than they had in the First World War. Although Boheman believed there was no immediate threat of an attack since Sweden wasn't part of any emerging blocs, the nation's valuable iron ore and its economic vulnerability created significant challenges for its neutrality. This sought-after resource would attract the attention of warring nations, while an economy heavily reliant on trade would leave Sweden open to political pressure. Boheman's message was clear. Sweden needed to negotiate its neutrality with all involved parties across every sector, including trade, to avoid becoming a target for reprisals. In essence, Sweden had to be prepared to make compromises if it meant protecting national security and interests. Those in the know, like Boheman, recognized that the law of neutrality could only provide a framework for Sweden's actions during a broader conflict, as there was no authority to enforce the respect of neutral rights by belligerents. This was especially clear in Northern Europe, where, apart from Sweden, no neutral country avoided invasion by either side of the conflict. Boheman's forecasts were startlingly on point. When the war in Europe began, Sweden faced two main challenges: its significant role as one of the continent's leading iron ore exporters and its strategic location between the warring nations. Iron ore, vital for steel production, was plentiful in northern Sweden but scarce in Central Europe. This created a critical vulnerability for Germany, which relied on Sweden for about 40% of its iron ore by 1939. If those shipments had stopped, Germany's weapons manufacturing would have taken a significant hit. In fact, the raw material was so crucial that Swedish diplomat Gunnar Hägglöf believed that if the iron ore mines were located in the south, Germany likely would have invaded Sweden to ensure continuous access. The mines' remote position in the far north and the implicit warning that Sweden would destroy them if attacked made any German military action less appealing and gave Sweden leverage in negotiations with both parties. Along with ball bearings, the iron ore supply was Sweden's most important contribution to Hitler's war efforts. Unsurprisingly, Britain demanded that Sweden halt all exports once it was at war with Germany, even going as far as threatening to target Swedish mines should shipments continue. 4 years later, the chief negotiator from the United States threatened to bomb factories and distribution centers in Gothenburg if Sweden did not stop exporting iron ore and ball bearings to Germany. Conversely, Germany warned that it would cut off crucial deliveries of coal, coke, and steel if Sweden didn't comply with its iron ore export quotas. Stockholm managed to navigate this situation by establishing war trade agreements with both Great Britain and Germany in late 1939 and early 1940, arriving at compromises with each side. However, these political arrangements were highly unstable and closely tied to the war's progress. After Germany launched its attack and took control of Denmark and Norway on April 9, 1940, Sweden's trade with the Allies was largely disrupted, which forced Swedish commerce to align more closely with the German economic vision. By June 6, 1944, when the Allies began to gain the upper hand after landing in Normandy, Stockholm felt the pressure and completely halted exports to Germany. This led to the perception that Sweden's wartime foreign policy was largely reactive. However, the main goal of Hansen's multi-party coalition was to steer clear of war, and so their decisions were primarily based on two questions. Would refusing demands provoke an invasion, or would accepting them lead to retaliation? Sweden's most contentious compromises involved agreements with Hitler that allowed the transport of German cargo, weapons, and troops on Swedish railways. Given Sweden's geostrategic location, once Denmark and Norway fell to Germany and Finland allied with it, Hitler's diplomats made demands for troop transport across Swedish land. After prolonged negotiations, the government, fearing invasion like its neighbors, gave in to these demands in July 1940, a time when liberal democracies in Europe were facing dire circumstances. Paris, Kaunas, Riga, and Tallinn had recently succumbed to the Germans and Soviets. Hansen understood the gravity of this concession, as it not only violated the principle of neutrality, but was likely to invite further German demands. Almost immediately, Sweden granted additional rights for German soldiers to transit through its territory, including in 1941, when the Engelbrecht Division was allowed passage to the Eastern Front, all under the threat of being labeled unfriendly by Germany. In essence, Sweden found itself without adversaries during the war, but its so-called friends were hardly friendly. Still, the result of this delicate balancing act was that Swedish sovereignty remained unbroken. Sweden kept its democratic government and engaged in peaceful relations with all countries, both Axis and Allied, throughout the 1930s and 1940s. Although those years posed significant risks to Sweden's national security, from their viewpoint, there was no interruption in relations with the warring nations as they had with each other. This situation allowed the Swedish government and its citizens to connect not only with neighboring European countries, but with the wider world as well. Swedish neutrality also offers a unique perspective on Japan's wartime experience, emphasizing continuity rather than disruption. Most notably, the typical time frame for the Second World War, from 1939 to 1945, doesn't adequately explain Sweden's interactions with Asia. When Hitler invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, nothing extraordinary happened in either Tokyo or Stockholm. Certainly, diplomats and politicians in both capitals were shocked, much like the rest of the world, but they did not become embroiled in the conflict. In fact, what is referred to today as Sweden's wartime cabinet wasn't established until December 13, 1939, while Japan dealt with internal cabinet disputes throughout 1939 to 1941. Both nations struggled to determine their political stance on the European war, yet their bilateral relations remained unchanged. Japan's response to the outbreak of the war in Europe mirrored that of Sweden, Switzerland, and the United States, as it declared its intention not to engage in the fighting. The Japanese neutrality toward the European conflict would hold for 2 years until the Navy attacked the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941. That trigger initiated a series of war declarations that severed peaceful ties between Japan and the Allied powers. For numerous Western diplomats and civilians in the empire, as well as for Japanese nationals in the West, this marked the beginning of extended internment and considerable hardship. For instance, the U.S. ambassador to Japan, Joseph C. Grew, and his team were abruptly isolated from the outside world and confined to their embassy, a fate that befell all enemy diplomats at the war's outbreak, and similarly affected Japanese diplomats in allied nations. Since Sweden maintained its neutrality, Stockholm's connections with Tokyo stayed just as strong as those with Washington, Berlin, Rome, and London. In fact, Swedish diplomacy became more active after the Pacific War began because Stockholm took on the role of a protecting power. This shift happened partly due to the disappearance of other neutral nations that had previously filled this role, most notably the United States after Pearl Harbor. Additionally, Japan found itself in a desperate position, losing many of its diplomatic allies as the war dragged on. The number of neutral countries available to help Japan communicate with its enemies dwindled significantly in the war's latter years, especially with the Soviet Union and Turkey declaring war in the summer of 1945, and Spain cutting diplomatic ties in April following the Manila Massacre. Sweden and Switzerland were the only two neutral nations that remained friendly with Japan, offering their support without interruption. This resulted in the continuation of trade between Stockholm and Tokyo, with diplomats in both capitals, frequent exchanges of telegrams, and ongoing negotiations over mutual interests. This book takes key moments from Japan's wartime experience to illustrate different phases of this bilateral relationship. It starts with events in China, where the Mukden incident on September 18, 1931, marked the start of Japan's violent expansion in Asia, which only concluded with the empire's surrender to the Allies on September 2, 1945. This periodization is quite common in Japan, where the term 15-year war was introduced by Tsurumi Shunsuke. Notable historians like Fujiwara Akira, Imai Seiichi, Eguchi Keiichi, and Hota Eri use this term, and it appears in textbooks and museums that emphasize Japan's expansion into Asia rather than its aggression in the Pacific. Some U.S. scholars also criticize the Eurocentric view of World War II. Edwin O. Reischauer, a respected Japanologist and later ambassador to Japan, argued that the war really began in 1937 at the Marco Polo Bridge. However, the concept of a 15-year war does have its critics. However, this concept is valuable for our discussion, as it reflects Sweden's prolonged engagement with violent Japan, which those foreign diplomats who witnessed it noted was quite different from other times. Thus, we adopt the term Long Second World War to describe this unique phase of Swedish neutrality, providing clarity to the question of neutral toward what? Specifically, neutrality toward Japan's 15 years of aggressive actions. We highlight significant moments for Japan as key points in our chronological narrative. After a brief introduction to the early stages of Swedish-Japanese relations, we'll explore the events of 1931, Japan's missteps in Manchuria, the fallout with the League of Nations, and Sweden's role within a political community striving in vain to curb Japan's expansion. This narrative culminates in the failure of the League system and its consequences for both Stockholm and Tokyo. The discussion continues with the aftermath of the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, now recognized as the official start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. This marked a shift in Swedish perspectives on East Asia and significantly influenced its trade and diplomatic relations. These changes grew more pronounced with the outbreak of war in Europe in 1939. The attack on Pearl Harbor in late 1941 signifies the next phase of our account. Lastly, there is an essay by Bert Edstrom detailing the Bagge Maneuver, a remarkable episode of Sweden's neutral diplomacy that occurred in late 1944 and early 1945, just before the conclusion of the long Second World War. Alongside neutrality, it's essential to understand Sweden's role as a diplomatic player. Despite its small size, With a population of just 6.3 million in 1938, Sweden enjoyed an independent foreign policy backed by a skilled diplomatic corps representing its interests globally. This positioned Sweden uniquely among the participants of the long Second World War, when much of the world remained colonized. Indonesia was still known as the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines was under U.S. colonial control. Washington acquired the archipelago from Spain during the 1898 U.S.-Spanish War. Around the same time, it claimed the neutral kingdom of Hawaii. Taiwan and Korea fell under Japan's control, while the British, Dutch, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Germans, and Italians governed regions like Indochina, the Indian subcontinent, parts of Arabia, and nearly all of Africa. These territories lacked statehood, which meant they had no foreign policy or diplomatic presence. Other nations were too young, small, or poor to develop effective foreign services. Take the Irish Free State, for example. It was established in 1922, but hadn't had enough time to build a team of diplomats to represent its interests in the Far East when the war began. Although Ireland chose to remain neutral, it had no diplomats in Japan and had yet to form economic ties with the empire. It wasn't until 1957 that diplomatic relations were established. Meanwhile, other sovereign neutral states like Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino had no presence in Japan due to their tiny size. The Vatican stood out as an exception. Despite being a city-state, it maintained a long-standing diplomatic tradition, even sending official representatives to Japan and China, where Pope Pius XII aimed to protect the interests of Catholics during the war. South American neutral countries, by contrast, were larger and had gained independence in the early 19th century. However, many of them had little economic interest across the Pacific and therefore didn't maintain strong diplomatic ties. Brazil and Argentina were noteworthy exceptions. Brazil had diplomatic relations with Japan since 1895, but cut all ties in 1942 after declaring war on Germany and Italy, declaring war on Japan much later on June 6, 1945. Argentina remained neutral for a significant period and did maintain diplomatic relations with Japan at the ambassadorial level. However, its ambassador, Rodolfo Moreno, was absent from Japan when the Pacific War broke out and couldn't return. Moreover, the chargé d'affaires had very limited resources, which made active diplomatic involvement in Japan impossible after 1941. Ultimately, Argentina declared war on Japan on March 27, 1945. Sweden, however, found itself in a completely different situation. Sweden operated 5 consulates across the Japanese archipelago and maintained diplomatic outposts in most of Japan's adversaries. This positioned Sweden as the second largest protecting power in World War II, just after Switzerland, providing good office services. Initially, this had little significance for Japan. During its military actions in China, Stockholm was more of a hindrance to Tokyo due to Sweden's activities at the League of Nations. However, once the war in the Pacific started, Sweden's good offices became crucial to Japan's wartime foreign policy. Acting as a protecting power and offering good office services involved taking on the diplomatic roles of a belligerent state within enemy territories. For instance, Sweden represented the Netherlands in Japan, assuming all responsibilities typically managed by the Dutch embassy. This included ensuring the safety of Dutch diplomats and civilians, negotiating with Tokyo for the Netherlands, delivering Dutch protests, and handling civil consular duties for Dutch nationals, such as officiating marriages and notarizing death certificates. The practice of offering good office services by neutral states has been long-standing and does not violate neutrality. It aligns with customary international law and is protected under Article 18b of the Second Hague Convention of 1907. Moreover, Sweden provided these services with the approval of both warring parties, as any neutral could only represent an enemy nation if the host country consented. In the case of the Netherlands, the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs officially recognized and permitted Swedish representation of Dutch interests in Japan. In exchange, the Netherlands acknowledged Sweden's role in representing Japanese interests in its territory, particularly since the Netherlands was occupied by Germany from May 1940 onward. Especially in critical areas like Hawaii, or in managing prisoners of war exchanges, Swedish support became an invaluable resource for the Japanese government. It would be an exaggeration to say that Tokyo entirely relied on neutral good offices, but records show that the Gaimusho appreciated Swedish support, and some officials even believed the Swedish minister could spark peace talks between Japan and the Allied powers. This indicates that Sweden maintained interactions with Japan throughout the war. However, it doesn't clarify why Sweden would take this approach. To grasp this, it's essential to understand the origins of the relationship between Sweden and Japan. Their ties go back to when Stockholm and Christiania were under the same monarchy. The United Kingdoms of Sweden and Norway was the 12th nation to form diplomatic relations with Japan after its long period of isolation. Much like Japan's connections with other Western nations, its relationship with Sweden saw a remarkable transformation. Initially seen as a backward and weak nation, Japan eventually gained membership among the great powers, alongside Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. By around 1895, Japan was recognized as a vibrant force in the East, advancing in a separate league from smaller nations like Sweden, which some perceived as a looming economic threat. This shift stemmed from Japan's rapid modernization, achieved in just a generation, and its victories in wars against China and Russia. Following the opening of China and Japan to Western interests after the Opium War and Commodore Perry's ultimatum, there was great optimism about the vast East Asian market among Swedish traders and shipping companies. By the late 1850s, the Swedish and Danish governments even contemplated sending a naval mission, following Perry's lead, to secure a treaty of friendship and trade with Japan. Yet, these plans for practical Scandinavianism were ultimately set aside. Although Sweden wasn't among the first maritime nations to reach out to Japan after its forced opening, it was the first to sign a treaty with the new Meiji government after the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate. Sweden did not establish its own embassy in Japan to negotiate the agreement, as it was essentially the same document already agreed upon by other great powers and Switzerland. This treaty granted more privileges to Western powers than to Japan and included a most favored nation clause. Signed on November 11, 1868, by Dirk de Graaf van Polsbroek, the minister-resident of the Netherlands, this document was one of many unequal treaties imposed on East Asian nations during that time. It granted extraterritorial rights to Swedish and Norwegian citizens while stripping Japan of its ability to set tariffs. Sweden was also allowed to inspect trade by sending warships into Japanese waters, though it's unlikely the Swedish Navy ever exercised this right. Despite these advantageous terms, Sweden's interest in Japan remained quite limited. For nearly 40 years, Stockholm didn't appoint a Swedish-Norwegian national as its diplomatic representative. Instead, Swedish diplomacy relied on Dutch and sometimes Spanish ministers for assistance. It wasn't until 1906 that a proper Swedish minister was appointed to manage relations with Japan. Initially, Japan itself had no diplomatic presence in Stockholm. It was only in 1880 that the Japanese envoy in St. Petersburg was also accredited to Sweden. Another 25 years passed before the first true minister was stationed in Stockholm, triggered by the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, during which Sweden stayed neutral. After that, the responsibilities of the Japanese minister in Stockholm gradually expanded. By 1907, he was also accredited to Oslo, in 1917 to Copenhagen, and in 1921 to Helsinki. Over time, Stockholm developed into a hub for Japan's diplomatic relations in Scandinavia. In terms of commerce, the outcome of the 1868 treaty was not significant. Trade and shipping did not bring in considerable profits. While there was a clear lack of initiative on the Swedish side, the Japanese perceived these trade agreements, made under duress, as a national misfortune that all Japanese leaders of the new Meiji period aimed to rectify as swiftly as possible. Tokyo's strong push for treaty revision became a key driver behind Japan's successful development strategy. This desire fueled Foreign Minister Prince Iwakura Tomomi's diplomatic mission to the United States and Europe, a remarkable journey lasting 20 months. During this tour, a delegation of about 50 representatives also spent a week in Sweden, where the Swedish government invested a significant amount to warmly welcome these esteemed visitors, reflecting its sincere interest in strengthening ties with Japan. Unfortunately, Sweden, like other Western capitals, turned down Japan's proposal for treaty revision. Despite this setback, the mission and the push for modernization led to a domestic industrialization program that gave Japan more bargaining power for equitable relations. Ultimately, in 1896, a new treaty was negotiated, marking a significant stride toward equality. The final restraints were lifted in 1911, symbolically ending Japan's humiliations from the 19th century. However, with modernization came the adoption of Western-style colonial practices, as Japan exerted control over Korea and Taiwan and even established its unequal treaties with China. In contrast, in Stockholm, Japan was still regarded as a minor issue. Sweden's diplomatic and economic indifference stemmed from its foreign policy, which did not prioritize competition with major colonial powers in global markets. There were also prevailing Swedish stereotypes that viewed Japan as a backward Asian nation. These attitudes began to shift only after Japan joined the ranks of the great powers, becoming comparable to heavyweight nations like Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. By around 1895, Swedish diplomats started to recognize Japan as a significant force in the East, with a shift in national sentiment occurring about a decade later. The year 1905 unexpectedly emerged as a pivotal point for Sweden's foreign policy in the early 20th century, marked by the end of its union with Norway after both the Norwegian parliament and citizens voted for independence. This change altered Sweden's strategic outlook significantly, leaving behind its previous status as a formidable power. Amid a European landscape of growing imperialistic nation-states, with Germany and Italy unified, Sweden emerged as a smaller power, prompting a shift toward more active diplomacy worldwide. In 1905, Japan achieved a significant military success against Tsarist Russia, marking a pivotal moment when Japan's empire was recognized as a great power by many Swedes. This victory was the first by an Eastern army over a European state in modern history. Some contemporaries viewed this unexpected triumph positively, celebrating the underdog's victory. Prominent figures like Sven Hedin, Hjalmar Kassel, and Rudolf Kellen wrote extensively, portraying Japan as a compliant student of the West, essential for stability and civilization in the East, while also suggesting it was immature and imitative. Concurrently, Kassel, Kellen, and Hedin warned of a yellow peril, suggesting an economic threat to whites, as German Emperor Wilhelm II had cautioned. They speculated that Europe would struggle to compete against the low labor costs in East Asia. During this time, Lafcadio Hearn wrote his renowned works on Japan, and Puccini's opera Madame Butterfly gained international acclaim. The magazine Var 8 Dag described Japan as this romantically idealized oriental country of the Mikado, the chrysanthemum, and the geishas. It's likely that this seemingly positive portrayal was fostered by the media to downplay Japan's transformation, reassuring European audiences that Japan remained distinct from the rational and modern West. Still, when Swedish observers compared East Asian nations, Japan was viewed as more normal, meaning more influenced by the West than its neighboring countries. In common discourse, it was depicted in stark contrast to China, which was deemed xenophobic, barbaric, and reactionary. This image was already well established before the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. A typical Swedish travel account from 1893 encapsulated it well. What a tremendous difference between Japan and China. In one place, everything is neat and tidy. In the other, it is dirty and smelly. In one nation, everything feels bright and cheerful, while in the other, there's a sense of gloom and control. Here, you're met with warmth and generosity. But there, you feel the cold eyes of suspicion upon you, knowing you are not welcome, whether the subtle hostility is shown overtly or not. Japan's changes stirred mixed feelings in Sweden and throughout the West, highlighting the typical ambivalence towards both Japanese and Chinese people in the early 20th century. The year 1905 marked a significant turning point in trade. Sweden had unique advantages on the global stage with its homegrown advanced technology, and as outdated agreements backed by military force were falling away, a fresh trade strategy began to emerge. Following the end of the union with Norway, a dedicated committee on diplomatic and consular issues recalibrated Sweden's foreign policy to focus on boosting trade. By prioritizing the export of high-quality goods, Swedish traders aimed to outshine foreign competitors. This committee concluded that strengthening ties with Asia was crucial, as regional trade hubs would be essential for accessing overseas markets. Unlike Denmark, which selected China as its eastern diplomatic base, the Swedish parliament opted to establish Japan as its focal point in Asia, largely due to the empire's military strength and the existing Swedish diplomatic presence there. In 1907, Dan Broström's Swedish East Asia Company launched a regular sea route connecting Gothenburg and Yokohama with stops in China. Another notable trend was the establishment of Swedish trading firms in the Far East. For instance, Knut Gedelius began his ventures in Japan in 1907, soon followed by others, yet Gedelius would always hold a distinct place in this landscape. His enterprise has been recognized as Sweden's first significant corporation within the machinery export sector, with a Japanese observer later noting that no foreign company had brought as many new engine designs and production techniques to Japan. At the same time, the committee's findings led to a significant transformation in the Swedish Foreign Service, making it accessible to individuals outside the aristocracy and expanding the pool of envoys. In 1906, Sweden's foreign ministry appointed Gustaf Oskar Wallenberg as its first true envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to Japan. Wallenberg was a prominent local ship owner from one of Sweden's leading financial families. His half-brother, Knut Wallenberg, would later serve as Sweden's foreign minister for most of World War I, and his grandson, Raoul Wallenberg, became renowned for rescuing thousands of Jews from Nazi deportation in Hungary. Gustaf Wallenberg represented a new type of diplomat, a businessman who recognized the vast potential of the East Asian market. From the outset of his mission in Tokyo, he focused not just on diplomatic relations with Japan, but on boosting Swedish trade across Asia. China, in particular, held great promise for a small export-driven nation, provided the right approach was taken. With a quarter of the world's population, China had immense needs that could be met by Japanese industry. The idea was that if Sweden could supply Japan, it would lead to a significant increase in Swedish exports due to Japan's rapid export growth. As a result, Wallenberg was also accredited to China in 1907, just a year after arriving in Japan. For a decade, he was a key player in the Swedish trade initiative in East Asia. His unwavering optimism fueled his persistent efforts to establish a presence for Swedish companies in both countries, turning the legation into a trade agency for commodities like pig iron and pulp. The outlook for Swedish trade with both Japan and China was promising. Locals preferred engaging with smaller European nations for trade and knowledge exchange rather than the larger imperial powers, which had previously forced them into unfavorable relationships. This new trading strategy proved relatively successful. Between 1908 and 1914, Swedish exports to Japan nearly tripled, growing from 2.27 million kroner to 6.32 million kroner. With an average inflation rate slightly above 1%, this indicated genuine growth in exports, rather than a mere increase on paper. By 1911, Sweden had established itself as the fifth largest European exporter to Japan. However, the same couldn't be said for imports. Aside from sulfur, tea, silk, and a few exotic items, goods coming from Japan were for a long time inconsequential and mainly handled by German intermediaries. A comparison of import and export values based on Japanese data highlights this disparity. It's important to note that at the time, Swedish and Japanese statistics were recorded using the country of purchase method rather than country of origin, making the reported figures for Japanese imports appear unrealistically low. In reality, much of what was acquired likely came through indirect means rather than direct trade. Nevertheless, Sweden maintained a significant trade surplus with Japan. The onset of the Great War disrupted Swedish maritime routes to Japan. Yet, during periods when shipments were feasible, they transported higher value goods, which actually increased trade profits. This was largely due to the absence of Germany as a trading partner, allowing neutral competitors like Sweden to step in. Thus, despite the conflict in Europe, the favorable trade relationship with Asia continued. By the end of Wallenberg's term in 1918, exports to Japan had more than doubled to 13.11 million kroner. The Great War in Europe did lead to considerable inflation, so not all revenue growth during this time resulted from an increase in actual goods exported. Particularly in the war's final 2 years, the Swedish economy faced significant hikes in the general price level of goods and services. Still, even considering this, it's clear that Sweden's trade strategy and Wallenberg's diplomacy succeeded in drawing more currency from Japan in exchange for Swedish products. Trade relations that benefited Sweden were on the rise. It was only after World War I that Swedish-Japanese trade notably began to slow for the first time. While this era marked a period of adjustment and a return to pre-war trade practices, the 1920s didn't witness the same gradual growth in exports that characterized the previous decade. Overall, it became a time of slight decline. It wasn't until the late 20s that imports started to rise again from their previously low levels. Before 1930, trade was quite limited, with sales of goods and services barely hitting 1% of Sweden's total export value. However, the Swedish corporate sector began to focus on the Far East, recognizing the market potential in its populous nations. Reports highlighted Japan's rapid industrial growth, predicting its rise as a significant player in the global economy. Despite the modest trade volume, Japan stood out as Sweden's primary customer outside the West in 1931. Japan was always viewed as a more crucial market than China from a Swedish business perspective. On the flip side, Sweden was Japan's main trading partner in Scandinavia, though it remained a minor player compared to countries like the United States and China. Sweden's key exports to Japan included paper, pulp, iron, steel, and advanced machine technology. It remains uncertain how much of what Sweden exported to Japan was later re-exported or utilized in products sent to mainland Asia. Nevertheless, Sweden's efforts to develop export markets in Asia had some success. In fact, among the Scandinavian nations, Sweden was the only one to establish significant ties with Japan during the early 20th century. Meanwhile, Swedish-Japanese cultural exchange faced stagnation. During the interwar years, the number of Japanese residing in Sweden was low, as was the number of Swedes in Japan, who were mainly businessmen and consulate staff. Following the devastating Kanto earthquake in 1923, some Swedes lost their homes and the consulate in Yokohama was destroyed. Although companies like Gedelius were affected, no Swedish citizens were harmed. Culturally, bilateral activities were sparse. In the 1920s, high-ranking Japanese dignitaries visited Sweden infrequently. The only significant visit was by Nitobe Inazo, the Vice Secretary General of the League of Nations, known for his pacifist beliefs. Conversely, a notable Swedish visit to Japan occurred in 1926 when the Swedish Crown Prince and his wife made a stop in Tokyo during their world tour. Prince Gustav Adolf spent more than a month in Japan, where he met with Prince Regent Hirohito in Tokyo, before planting a tree at the C.P. Thunberg Memorial in Nagasaki. Articles in the Japanese press helped foster goodwill towards Sweden. However, the visit was largely ceremonial and lacked political significance. It was marred by news of a sudden illness that Gustav Adolf experienced and rumors about a knife attack at the British embassy during a luncheon for the Crown Prince. In August 1930, Prince Takamatsu, Hirohito's younger brother, along with his consort, returned the visit to Stockholm, seizing the chance to check out a major exposition the city hosted that year. Throughout the early part of the century, Swedish-Japanese relations thrived. In an interview with the newspaper Chogai Shogyo Shinpo, Japanese envoy Hioki Eki noted that the Japanese had been particularly welcomed in Sweden since 1905 due to Sweden's long-standing aversion to Russia. He remarked that Japan received extremely important intelligence from the Stockholm legation during the Russo-Japanese conflict. Nevertheless, Japan's membership in the Entente caused some tension with neutral countries. In 1918, Envoy Wallenberg was recalled after accusations of contact with the German side, although later investigations cleared him. Japan's push at Versailles for a declaration on racial equality was met with skepticism by Wallenberg's successor in Tokyo, David Bergstrom, who had ties to the Swedish Liberal Party and viewed imperialist countries with caution. A well-known journalist and former member of parliament, he gained fame as a public intellectual and championing universal suffrage in his articles, which endeared him to left-wing liberals, while conservatives largely opposed his views. Unlike Wallenberg, who was a businessman, Bergström was a politician keen on the evolution of Taisho democracy and the various political institutions formed during that time. Despite his reservations, like Wallenberg, he focused significantly on enhancing trade relations, achieving peak export revenue during his tenure. Bergström was succeeded by Oskar Eberlöf in 1923. He, too, was part of the government, though from the bureaucratic side of things. He had been Chancellor and head of the Department of Legal Affairs since 1907, and then served as the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs from 1913 to 1918. While Eberlöf may not have been an industrialist like Wallenberg or a politician like Bergström, he was well acquainted with trade and political matters. He was a member of the State Commerce Commission from 1915 to 1917, which gave him insight into the importance of trade negotiations. This knowledge became crucial during his assignment in Asia, when he participated in the Special Conference on Chinese Customs Tariff in 1925. The conference was set up in line with the 1922 Washington Naval Conference and the Nine Power Treaty, which aimed to solidify the open-door policy in China for the United States, Japan, and European nations. It granted Japan special rights in Manchuria, while ensuring that the rest of China remained equally accessible to any nation wanting to engage in business there. In exchange, China was assured that discussions on customs tariffs and extraterritoriality would be revisited soon. This significant conference took place on October 26, 1925. Although Sweden was not one of the original signatories of the Nine Power Treaty, which included nations like the United States, Japan, and the United Kingdom, Beijing invited other major seafaring countries, Sweden, Denmark, Spain, and Norway, to the follow-up meeting. Delays due to riots and political unrest in Beijing stalled negotiations, and as the conference progressed, disagreements about the country's internal tariff systems led to a deadlock. Eberlöf, along with his Danish counterpart, played a key role in facilitating dialogue during these challenging times. Ultimately, the treaty that allowed China to reclaim its tariff autonomy after 8 decades was finalized on November 19, 1926. For Sweden, this treaty and its status as a guarantor nation to China became vital elements of its foreign policy towards Asia in the years to come. In Stockholm, the interwar period saw a second wave of reforms within the Foreign Service, which began to broaden its scope. By around 1930, the ministry was structured into 3 bureaus responsible for political, commercial, and legal affairs. There were also sections focused on administration, press, and archives. The ministry employed around 70 people. Foreign policy primarily fell under the purview of the foreign minister and his team, with minimal interference from the rest of the government. The level of interest from prime ministers varied. Foreign ministers often held prominent roles, such as party leaders or former prime ministers. Key figures in shaping Stockholm's foreign policy included state secretaries and the heads of the political bureau. They drafted memorandums, put decisions into action, and served as gatekeepers of conversations and written communications, allowing them significant control over information flow. A crucial element of their work consisted of reports regularly received from Swedish diplomats around the globe. Overall, the foreign ministry cultivated a conservative and traditional atmosphere. Memoirs indicate that most staff were quite skeptical of the new diplomacy. Emerging from Sweden's membership in the League of Nations, the rise of democracy in 1918 to 1921 brought with it increasing calls for an open foreign policy, one that held accountability to elected parliamentarians. In 1921, the Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs was established to replace the previous secret committee. This council consisted of 16 members from all parliamentary parties, except the Communists, who were appointed each year during parliamentary sessions. They met several times annually for direct updates from the Foreign Ministry. All discussions were kept secret due to the sensitive nature of the international information involved. Within a year, members received confidential reports detailing world events through a national lens, as well as summaries of Swedish foreign policy. These reports were commonly known as white papers. If at least 6 councillors wished to address a topic, it was added to the official agenda. However, the council was purely advisory and had no formal authority over decisions made by the foreign ministry. They did not utilize independent expertise from sources outside the foreign service. Therefore, the council did not achieve the level of influence that had been anticipated. Before long, there were renewed calls for greater transparency and the establishment of a comprehensive parliamentary committee. This committee was formed in 1937 with the duty of addressing foreign policy matters more openly and with oversight authority. However, the shift was not particularly significant since the members of the new Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Affairs were the same individuals from the prior Advisory Council. Additionally, during discussions of foreign policy within Parliament, it had become standard practice to accept government proposals without any alterations, and this trend continued. While political institutions may have evolved, the political culture lagged behind. In terms of trade policy, there was a duplication of responsibilities. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs handled questions about trade agreements and navigation, alongside international political conferences and gathering commercial information abroad through Sweden's diplomatic channels. In contrast, a distinct Ministry of Trade was created in 1920, responsible for domestic and foreign trade decisions. By the trade minister's side were a cabinet secretary and the head of administration, leading 2 separate bureaus within the ministry. The Director General of the National Board of Trade, charged with promoting Swedish commerce, answered to the Ministry of Trade. For matters of foreign trade, they engaged with pertinent interest groups, including the Swedish General Association of Exporters, a business group dating back to 1887, and various regional chambers of commerce. Trade policy principles and specific issues such as tariff proposals were often debated in Parliament. In the early 1930s, Swedes' primary activities in East Asia included foreign trade, Christian missionary work, and exploration, with the latter 2 predominantly focused on China. Swedish missionaries did not pursue conversions in Japan, and explorers like Sten Bergman, who documented the Kurils, Korea, and other areas related to the Japanese Empire, were quite rare. Swedish-Japanese relations were heavily based on trade, particularly after Japan became Sweden's largest export market outside of the West in 1931, with occasional cultural exchanges accompanying this growing commercial bond. On November 7, 1931, a significant Japanese art exhibition opened in Stockholm, organized by the Swedish-Japanese Association. It was a remarkable success, featuring items from Swedish museums and private collectors, including pieces from the royal house. The opening included speeches by Swedish Foreign Minister Baron Frederick Ramel and Japanese envoy Viscount Mushokoji Kintomo. Politically, it seemed that Japan and Sweden were on track for another decade of fruitful relations. Both Ramel and Mushokoji expressed hopes that the exhibition would enhance mutual understanding and goodwill between their peoples. However, they were unaware that a challenging road lay ahead. Just weeks earlier, a minor incident occurred in a remote part of China, setting off a period of soul-searching and strain in Swedish-Japanese relations. On September 18, 1931, an explosion struck the Japanese-run South Manchurian Railway near Mukden, the center of Manchuria. The blast caused by TNT inflicted no injuries and didn't significantly damage the railway tracks, yet Japan's media and military quickly blamed Chinese activists. This Manchurian incident, as it became known, was actually a staged attack by officers from the Kanto Army stationed on the Kanto Peninsula. Since gaining the right to station troops there in 1905 after the Russo-Japanese War, Japan was responsible for guarding the railway. The Kanto Army had become a hub of militant extremism since the 1920s, growing increasingly hostile to China and its nationalist movement. Its leaders were disillusioned with the parliamentary and pacifist approaches of Tokyo's political elite, which initially did not support their actions during the incident. The entire situation resembled a coup intended to pressure the central government into action in China. And it worked. In Tokyo, a restless press and public opinion demanded a strong response against the anti-Japanese elements they blamed for what they termed a Chinese terrorist act. The Kanto army seized this opportunity to launch a significant military campaign across Manchuria. Although many abroad suspected a conspiracy behind the railway explosion, they could not substantiate it. Soon, the government under Liberal Prime Minister Wakatsuki Reijiro felt it had no choice but to adapt to the new reality, fearing that public dissent could result in a serious blow to national pride. A few months later, following intense military pressure, the Wakatsuki cabinet stepped down and was succeeded by a leadership more inclined towards expansion. On November 5th, Envoy Mushokoji presented Japan's official version of events to the UD, claiming that Japanese troops were acting defensively against local bandits and were not invading militarily. Rommel suggested that an independent investigation committee might be necessary to persuade the Chinese side of Japan's perspective. However, Mushokoji dismissed this idea, arguing that the conflict was beyond the comprehension of distant European observers. He asserted that a cultural barrier hindered many foreigners from grasping the true nature of the conflict in China, a common narrative in the 1930s that even appeared in some white papers from the Swedish government. Mushokoji seemed to reflect this benevolent viewpoint toward Japan's stance, noting that Scandinavians were accustomed to being on the sidelines of global politics, typically avoiding expressions of support for countries in conflict. He advised Tokyo to refrain from active propaganda in the peaceful north. The confrontation between China and Japan in Manchuria was a pivotal moment in interwar political history, signaling the end of a decade characterized by relative peace, optimism, and trust within the League of Nations, and marking the onset of renewed global tensions and rearmament. East Asia was merely the first of many regions where developments took a troubling turn. In January 1932, as conflict erupted in Shanghai, the Kanto army asserted that a robust independence movement was rising among the Manchu people. On March 1st, Manchurian nationalists proclaimed that northeastern China would now be a separate entity called Manchukuo. It was clear to most international observers that this new state was engineered by the Japanese military. The rapid developments unfolded in blatant disregard of international law, leading to the swift removal of Manchu territory from China's control. The Kanto army exploited divisions within China to accomplish this. In 1932, they reinstated Puyi, the young, previously dethroned emperor, as the head of Manchukuo, where he would regain the title of emperor 2 years later. Believing he was serving the interests of his people, the naive Puyi ultimately became nothing more than a puppet for the Japanese. This crisis in the East posed a significant challenge to the League of Nations, prompting an investigation. At the request of the Republic of China, an extraordinary assembly was convened, driven by concerns about the implications for collective security in Europe. This was a crucial test for the League's ability to uphold international law. The Assembly decided to establish a commission led by former British Governor of Bengal, Lord Lytton, to undertake a vital but lengthy fact-finding mission. In September 1932, Japan formally recognized Manchukuo as a sovereign state, sparking another outcry from the international community. Eventually, in 1933, the League adopted a resolution regarding the incident, recognizing Japan's special position in the region and recommending autonomy with local governance overseen by Japanese advisors, while also affirming China's sovereignty over Manchuria. The Japanese government rejected this outcome and withdrew from the League. Although this situation could have led to sanctions against Japan, Europe faced serious new challenges due to an economic depression, leaving China isolated and Japan's aggression unchecked. Ultimately, the League failed to address the underlying issues in East Asia, with both Japan and China waiting for the right moment to resolve their conflicts. They faced various challenges right away. The Republic of China, led by General Chiang Kai-shek, had to focus its efforts on fighting off the communists at home, while Japan was caught in a fierce internal conflict among conservatives in the imperial court, extremists in the military, and shifting political parties. Unexpectedly strong public support for Japan's parliamentarism emerged during the general election of 1936, favoring moderate parties. However, a military faction pushing for direct imperial rule, a euphemism for military dictatorship, responded fiercely with a bloody coup attempt. Prime Minister Okada Keisuke narrowly avoided assassination, while his finance minister and former prime minister, Takahashi Korikyo, who had opposed boosting military budgets, was killed in his own home. The rebellion eventually ended thanks to the emperor's intervention. While the rebellious officers seemingly lost the immediate conflict, they ultimately strengthened their political influence. Their message resonated. No moderate politician in Japan could feel secure opposing their aims. Japan was on an unyielding path toward a system where militarists, not democrats, held the power. Meanwhile, in Europe, Benito Mussolini achieved a crucial victory in his aggressive campaign. On the 5th of May, 1936, Ethiopian forces surrendered as Addis Ababa fell to Italian troops. This breach of the League of Nations principles dashed hopes of restoring a law-based order globally. Coupled with Germany's move into the Rhineland and the League's failure to intervene, a new balance of power emerged in Europe. Anti-League countries aligned, resulting in the Anti-Comintern Pact between Germany and Japan on the 25th of November, 1936, with Italy joining the following year, marking the start of the Axis powers alliance. Adding to this turbulence, the Spanish Civil War erupted in the summer of 1936, catching the democratically elected socialist government in Madrid off guard as it confronted royalist rebels led by General Francisco Franco. Western democracies appeared increasingly vulnerable and defensive. In Stockholm, the initial reports on the Manchurian incident faded into the background following Britain's decision to drop the gold standard. It became clear over the next few months that the situation in China was not going to resolve quickly, and that Manchuria, a rather unfamiliar region in the Far East, would significantly influence global politics. During the early 1920s, very few Swedes were involved in trade or missionary work there, with the notable exception of Major Karl Taube, who resided in Mukden, served as a military advisor to warlord Zhang Zuolin, and authored a book on the incident. Despite its seemingly desolate appearance, this troubled region began to hold unexpected importance for Swedish commerce in three main areas. Firstly, regarding oil imports. In 1908, international traders recognized the potential of the Manchurian soybean. Since then, increasing amounts of soybean cake, and particularly soybean oil, were exported to Europe, notably by the Swedish East Asian Company. The soybean was found to be high in vegetable fat, making it valuable for margarine, chocolate, soap, cosmetics, and even synthetic rubber or art silk. Additionally, this bean was easy to store, packed with protein, and could be consumed directly or used as livestock feed, which helped ease Sweden's anxieties about malnutrition during agricultural downturns. At the peak of the later European War, soybeans even served as a substitute for coffee beans to produce what Yuriko Onodera described as the Swedish national beverage. Envoy J.E.E. Holtman in Tokyo once emphasized that the entire world relies on the flow of oil from the Manchurian fields. Secondly, the trading firm Gedelius recognized Manchuria's potential and established an office in Dieren as early as 1921. Over the next decade, they carved out a niche in the southern Manchurian mining sector, focusing on iron ore extraction and rock drilling. Lastly, Svenska Kullagerfabriken, another key trading company, also began to take a keen interest in Manchuria. In 1931, the SKF Company magazine highlighted the region as a promising future market for Swedish ball-bearing exports, particularly due to the fact that the railways in the southern area were among the best in the world. Additionally, it was noted that the South Manchurian Railway was already heavily reliant on ball bearings from Sweden, and some machinery in the major military factories in Mukden also utilized SKF products. In essence, the significance of Manchuria to Swedish trade grew unexpectedly and was largely overlooked by Swedish politicians, leading to a diplomatic challenge after the Mukden incident. In March 1932, when the League of Nations called its members to a special assembly, Stockholm found itself needing to clarify its position. However, there was little consensus on two main topics: Sweden's relationship with the League and its stance on Asian matters. At that time, the most powerful political group was the Social Democratic Workers' Party, but lacking an outright majority, the Social Democrats were not a part of the government. Instead, the center-left minority government led by Prime Minister Carl Gustav Ekman was in control. This government was mainly made up of the teetotaler, free-minded National Association. On the right side of Parliament, there was a small Liberal Party and a more influential Conservative Party, while agrarian interests were represented by the Farmers' League. There were also two working-class parties, the Communists, who strictly adhered to Moscow's commands, and the Socialists, who claimed independence from foreign influence. However, both red parties played only a minor role due to being sidelined by the larger established movements. On the issue of the League of Nations, most parties, aside from the Communists, were divided between two perspectives. One highlighted the need for a shift in Swedish foreign policy, while the other emphasized the importance of continuity and tradition. The first approach was generally seen as idealist or internationalist, while the latter focused on traditionalist, national interests, or at most Scandinavian concerns, which could be described as realist in the context of contemporary international relations. Sweden became a member of the League of Nations in 1920 following a heated parliamentary debate won by the internationalist left. After that vote, many traditionalists shifted their views to accept Sweden's membership in the League. Nonetheless, lingering doubts about Geneva persisted, with skeptics such as KG expressing concerns. Westman sarcastically described Swedish involvement in the League as a functionalist superstructure on Swedish foreign policy. The idealists viewed the crisis in Manchuria primarily as an issue of international law and the League of Nations' peaceful efforts, placing the blame solely on Japan and its military actions. This perspective was echoed by several vocal Christian and pacifist groups, who believed that aggression against distant nations became a matter for all countries under the League's principle of solidarity. The most vocal advocate for internationalism was Östen Undén, a law professor and former foreign minister in two social democratic governments. Undén was widely regarded as Sweden's leading authority on international law, and he took a distinctly legalistic stance on world affairs. During a public address at Uppsala University on February 2, 1932, he condemned Japan's violent actions in Shanghai and accused it of disrupting global peace. He called for a strong response from the League, although he did not specify what actions he was seeking. Like many internationalists, Undén held the League in high regard and believed that Sweden, along with other small nations, held a prestigious role as selfless advocates for peace within the organization. They were perceived as the League's watchdogs, exerting a moral influence in Geneva to pressure the great powers. However, supporters of the League were divided on one crucial issue: how to achieve collective security effectively. Most Swedish internationalists strongly opposed armed sanctions, leaning instead towards an economic blockade, while a small but influential faction within the Social Democratic Party was skeptical of any governmental action, believing that a united effort from the working class around the world would be sufficient to prevent wars. More moderate left-wing figures, especially those aligned with Arthur Engberg, the influential editor of Social Demokraten, advocated for a more cautious approach, emphasizing that Sweden should not become embroiled in war, even one undertaken for peace. This stance, however, sparked frustration among the most passionate activists. An editorial in the Svenska Morgonbladet, Sweden's leading Christian pacifist newspaper, called for decisive action from smaller nations at Geneva on February 24, 1932. The article sparked widespread backlash and gained international attention since the Svenska Morgonbladet was closely aligned with the government. Its views were often seen as mirroring official policy. Ultimately, Prime Minister Ekman needed to clarify that he was unaware of the article's existence. Meanwhile, the right-wing opposition reacted differently to the Manchurian crisis. For the business community, stability was essential for trade in East Asia, supported by experts informed about local conditions in China. Their parliamentary representatives, the liberals and conservatives, had less faith in collective security and continued to advocate for neutrality. They believed that this seemingly outdated approach was compatible with Sweden's League membership. They argued that the crisis highlighted the need for greater stability in chaotic China, which aligned with the Japanese perspective. These realists opposed the disarmament that followed the Defense Act of 1925 and sought to strengthen Sweden's military capabilities. They viewed the events in Manchuria as evidence against relying on security guarantees from the League, mere pieces of paper without real significance. They contended that this justified prioritizing military defense. However, divisions also existed among the realists. One debate concerned the nature of the League itself. The moderately conservative newspaper Svenska Dagbladet represented a faction that wanted to support the League's ideals, despite acknowledging its practical limitations. It defended Geneva against critiques from Tokyo, labeling Japan as the aggressor. Nevertheless, Svenska Dagbladet didn't anticipate Sweden taking the lead in the push for international order, suggesting that it should wait for the great powers, Britain and France, to resolve the situation. Many voices in the conservative press opposed the League, with some praising Japan for revealing the fraud behind collective security guarantees. There was a consensus that Sweden should remain uninvolved, as this conflict did not pertain to its national interest. These perspectives contradicted the internationalist belief that everything concerns everyone. The only significant newspaper to fully support Japan was the Göteborgs Handels- och Sjöfartstidning, a liberal publication allied with business sectors in the trading port. Its editor-in-chief, Torgny Segerstedt, often expressed unpopular opinions. He criticized legalists who viewed international order merely as upholding existing borders and maintaining the status quo. Segerstedt believed that a true international order could only exist with justice and balance among nations. He argued that Japan, as an emerging trading power, faced discrimination from tariff barriers and racist laws limiting Japanese immigration, largely due to the actions of major Western nations, particularly the United States. He emphasized the need for Japan to escape its dire circumstances. Segerstedt uniquely highlighted economic factors contributing to the unrest in East Asia, and was likely the only commentator to address the tension between honoring international treaties and the need for peaceful adjustments within the Versailles framework. His support for Japan did not equate to an endorsement of authoritarianism or militarism. During the years of the European War, he gained a reputation as a staunch critic of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. Among the Swedish populace, there was a small and obscure group of fascism-leaning conservatives who dismissed the conflict between Japan and China as insignificant. They viewed it as a fabrication of politicians in Geneva, convinced that both Asian nations shared a common goal: to surpass the West and challenge the dominance of white people. In their view, this posed a grave threat, a real yellow peril, that could only be addressed through national rearmament. Throughout the early 1930s, discussions in the Swedish legislature typically focused on issues such as unemployment insurance, tariffs, and food prices. Speeches on foreign affairs were infrequent and usually made by Riksdag members without any government ties. Conversely, the communists and the leaders of the small Socialist Party took every chance to denounce the League as a group driven by capitalist great power interests. However, 1932 unfolded in a rather unusual way. During the political debates on January 18th and 19th, East Asia was addressed, and by February 26th it became the central topic in discussions about Sweden's stance in Geneva. Most of the speakers belonged to left-leaning parties, while conservatives, liberals, and farmers participated far less. Ultimately, the divisions mirrored those within the press. A notable feature of this discussion was that all parties often used the Manchurian situation as a stand-in for the ongoing discourse about Swedish defense. Hence, rather than a calm and detached exchange, the conversation was charged with emotion. The anticipated disarmament conference of the League of Nations had already begun in February, arguably less than ideal timing, and Swedish delegates were soon faced with the need to take an official stance on both disarmament and the Far Eastern crisis. Given the secrecy surrounding these discussions, Parliament gathered behind closed doors on March 4, 1932. According to parliamentary rules, this was only permitted for sensitive foreign policy matters, which was rare. Only 6 such instances occurred throughout the interwar period. The special session on East Asia, lacking any available minutes, would be the shortest ever held. Ultimately, the leading parties aimed to project unity and supported the government. Despite typical divisions on foreign policy, it became customary to aim for a consensus before heading to Geneva. Similarly, like the editorials found in the press, parliamentary speeches about the escalating Sino-Japanese conflict often highlighted grand ideals but seldom touched on specific sanctions. The Prime Minister minimized the importance of the sanctions clause in the League Covenant, Article 16, asserting that Sweden's primary role should be in promoting strong, clear, and resolute declarations. In contrast, the business community favored a more low-profile Swedish response to the Manchurian crisis. Trading houses were concerned about losing foreign clients due to sudden political events in Stockholm. They aimed to keep their markets and were intrigued by the opportunities presented by a new country, Manchukuo. Many business representatives leaned pro-Japanese, with Knut Gedelius leading the way. He had relocated his trading firm to Yokohama as early as 1907. While Gedelius was not aligned with the militarist faction in Japanese politics, he understood the conflict from the perspective of his host nation. He believed that most Swedish politicians lacked a grasp of the actual situation in China. Like others in trade, he grew increasingly frustrated by the loud calls coming from the internationalist left back home. The idealist editorial in Svenska Morgonbladet pushed him over the edge. On February 26, a group of prominent business figures in Gothenburg sent a telegram to Prime Minister Ekman, urging the Swedish government to exercise caution in Geneva. They were backed by their newspaper, Göteborgs Handels och Sjöfarts Tidning. This move prompted Ekman to distance himself from the editorial in Svenska Morgonbladet. Unsurprisingly, this crisis posed significant challenges for Sweden's diplomats and foreign policy makers. It raised fundamental questions, such as where to find reliable information about this largely unfamiliar region. Most accessible information came from European or American correspondents based in Shanghai or Tokyo, who were far removed from the actual conflict and whose reports were often filtered through Western news agencies. Genuine insider intelligence regarding the mysterious events near Mukden reached the Ministry of Foreign Affairs only through telegrams and letters from legations and consulates in the Far East, and sometimes they had to wait weeks for essential updates. According to the government report to the Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs, the most credible insights originated from the Swedish minister to Japan, J.E.E. Hultman, who succeeded Iwerlöf. Like many of his Western counterparts, he viewed the situation in Manchuria as indicative of a broader conflict within Japan's power structures, marking a military and nationalist uprising against the parliamentary government, international diplomats, and the conservative circles surrounding the emperor. Hultman interpreted this as the emergence of a dangerous faction within Japan opposing the old elite. The assessment was largely on point. Swedish diplomats around the globe reported back on the indifferent and passive attitudes of the great powers and smaller colonial nations like the Netherlands. They also expressed their suspicions towards China, frequently describing it as a nearly anarchic state threatened by Bolshevism. Just like the business community, they voiced their disapproval of China's lawlessness, a recurring theme in their communications, which often led to a preference for Japan. For example, former envoy Iwerlöf stated in an interview regarding the Manchurian situation that his sympathies leaned more towards Japan, seeing it as a force for progress, order, and development that China struggled to achieve on its own. Government viewpoints were similarly mixed. While a white paper issued in 1932 was strictly neutral and provided a straightforward account of events in East Asia, an earlier white paper from 1930 made it clear that the region did not genuinely belong to China. Additionally, reports known as the Blue Papers, which concerned League of Nations meetings, touched on the conflict between Japan and China, but did so cautiously, refraining from blaming either side for violating any agreements. They only hint at Japan's delaying tactics in Geneva. At the same time, Outdated stereotypes of Asia still lingered, views of an enigmatic land and its people as largely inscrutable. In this context, the 1932 White Paper suggested that the hidden motives behind the visible events elude any observer unfamiliar with Eastern thinking. Ultimately, Foreign Minister Baron Frederick Rammel, a seasoned diplomat, refrained from issuing warnings or statements of condemnation. Even on October 30th, 1931, he characterized the conflict as complex, indicating that Sweden could not determine who was at fault in the recent Manchurian issues. This ambiguity in both internal and external evaluations led to a rather hesitant initial reaction to the events in the Far East. For the Swedish government, there was uncertainty regarding the situation in Japan or Manchuria, and it was reluctant to offend the only great power in that region. Thus, Stockholm initially sought to maintain a balanced stance. It subtly critiqued Japan while simultaneously halting arms sales to China. There was a hope that Sweden wouldn't have to confront the Manchurian crisis any further. In the fall of 1931, many thought the League Council could resolve the incident. However, as the crisis dragged on, more reports reached the Foreign Ministry, making it clear that Japanese actions, whether orchestrated by Tokyo or spontaneously initiated by the Kwantung Army, were contradicting the League's covenant principles. This realization posed a dilemma for Stockholm, forcing a choice between economic interests and political values. Should Sweden openly denounce Japan's actions, risking its economic connections? Or would it be better to bide time without issuing strong condemnations? Both options were unsatisfactory. On one side, Tokyo had become a crucial player in Sweden's trade strategy with the Far East, and the consequences of vocal opposition to Japan were unpredictable. On the other, a fundamental principle was at stake: the League of Nations' core tenet that no member could violate another's sovereignty. This was central to the idealistic mission in Geneva and a foundation of Swedish foreign policy since 1919. Using Arnold Wolfer's framework, this situation created a clash between possession goals and milieu goals. For the small nation of Sweden, supporting international stability in Asia was a way to uphold the League's authority in Europe. Such sentiments resonated within the Swedish center-left government led by C.G. Ekman. Thus, the goal was clear. Stockholm would advocate for a solution that aligned with the League's standards. On February 8, 1932, as chaos escalated in Shanghai, Chinese envoy Zhu Changnian urgently called on Sweden for support at the League of Nations. A prompt reply didn't come, but Sweden was working on a strategy for the Extraordinary Assembly. The responsibility of drafting formal guidance for the government's representatives fell to the ever-present idealist Östen Undén. His appointment indicated the direction Sweden intended to take in Geneva. Undén would indeed steer Sweden's foreign policy, while Foreign Minister Rammel kept a lower profile. Undén's position was clear. The Articles of the Covenant were straightforward and applied universally. He completed his draft in late February, which openly criticized Japan's military actions. While Japanese diplomats argued that justice allowed for changing an unfair situation threatening their nation, Undén maintained that international justice meant violent changes to the current state and its borders could never be justified. Accepting views based on might makes right would set dangerous precedents, even jeopardizing Sweden's own security. He established Swedish policy rooted in the internal political discourse and principles of international law, rather than the arguments from diplomatic reports coming out of the Far East. Undén, along with the Ekman government, paid attention to the strong left-wing voices advocating for collective security. Stockholm should make its voice heard on the global stage and uphold the League of Nations as it had under Prime Minister Hjalmar Branting, a prominent advocate of idealism and pacifism in the early 1920s in Geneva. Following an uproar from an article in the Svenska Morgonbladet, Foreign Minister Rammel had to soften Undén's draft to avoid being perceived as overly anti-Japanese. Nonetheless, it was time to move forward. Carl Ivan Westman, Sweden's envoy to Switzerland, was tasked with rallying multilateral support for Sweden's stance by establishing a coalition of like-minded small states within the League, a challenging endeavor given the lack of a cohesive small state opinion. Even neighboring Scandinavians, Denmark and Norway, were not initially supportive of an assertive policy. A meeting on February 29th resulted in an agreement on several key demands. A ceasefire must be arranged for Shanghai. The major issues surrounding the Manchurian dispute needed to be referred to mediation and arbitration, and the assembly session should not conclude, only adjourn, until the conflict was resolved. In early March, Ekman convened the Advisory Council on Foreign Affairs to ensure alignment behind the official stance. Secrecy was maintained, and no records were kept. Yet Arvid Lindman's documents reveal that the meeting was hardly peaceful. Roemmel emphasized the need for small states to be proactive in advocating for international law. On the other hand, the Conservatives and the Farmers' League expressed their support for a cautious approach, arguing that Sweden should not expose itself. This stance was expected, given their preference for upholding neutrality. What was surprising, however, was that Arthur Engberg, a prominent social democrat, aligned with them. Prime Minister Ekman, on the contrary, firmly asserted that no situation in the League's history had been clearer. Sweden had to take action. Ultimately, the government prevailed. The official instructions were tweaked slightly, and the Riksdag was convened for a closed session. The foreign minister received the green light to engage with the business community, explaining that Sweden must not be hindered by short-sighted material motives. From that point on, collective security would be Sweden's guiding principle, rather than favoritism toward either side in the conflict. On the 16th of February, the League Council urged Japan to respect the territorial integrity of all member states. Swedish delegates were directed to back this appeal and advocate for an immediate ceasefire in Shanghai. True to form, the delegates came from various political parties. Rickard Sandler represented the Social Democrats, Elio Löfgren the Liberals, Arvid Lindman the Conservatives, and K.G. Westman the Farmers' League. It was time for Sweden to make its stance known. At the request of the still-absent Minister Roemmel, Löfgren, a former foreign minister, lawyer, and leader of the small Liberal Party, addressed the League on the 5th of March. Until just a few days ago, conditions in the Far East have worsened, and while reports may seem contradictory, it is undeniable that what is unfolding is war in every sense. I won't comment on what the League has done to resolve this troubling conflict. No one can deny, especially in light of the League Committee's report from Shanghai dated the 3rd of February, that the military actions taken in the China-Japan conflict violate existing treaties. Sweden has consistently asserted during discussions at the League that the Covenant's ban on armed force remains fully valid, regardless of whether either party labels such actions as war. According to the Swedish government, deploying troops and executing military operations on another nation's territory directly contravenes both the Covenant and the Pact of Paris. Allowing a distorted interpretation of legitimate defense in this case would undermine the very foundation of international law. I acknowledge the complexities of the conflict and the unique situations in the Far East. However, these circumstances cannot be used by any party as a reason to bypass the conciliation and arbitration procedures established in the Covenant. Löfgren's speech, though it may seem rational and composed by today's standards, was groundbreaking at the time and for the League itself. His choice of words, particularly in the original French, characterized Japanese actions as a crisis that was a guerre en tout, sauf le nom, a war in all but name. This was the strongest possible indictment, precisely the phrasing that the Chinese representatives sought from the League. It escalated the incident to the level of warfare, which was something Tokyo was desperate to avoid, as it could trigger Articles 15 and 16 of the Covenant, leading to sanctions, expulsion, or even military intervention. No one else that day condemned Japanese actions with the same intensity as Löfgren. However, Sweden was not alone in its stance. Several smaller nations also spoke in support of China, including representatives from Spain, Czechoslovakia, and Switzerland. In contrast, some countries took a more ambiguous approach. For instance, Finland, typically a strong proponent of collective security, did not echo Sweden's position due to its pro-Japanese sentiment rooted in the Russo-Japanese War, which had led to Finland's independence. The most hesitant were the League's major powers, France and Britain. The British Foreign Secretary, John Simon, openly sought to placate Tokyo, suggesting that applying the covenant to this conflict might not be feasible. Simon, representing Japan's former ally from World War I, aimed to address the crisis through political practicality rather than legal standards. Despite rumors of British influence over SavedWhen, Sweden, alongside Switzerland, chose to align with the true stance of China. They proposed a resolution that sought negotiations between the involved parties while insisting on the withdrawal of Japanese forces from Shanghai, a demand Japan found unacceptable. Ultimately, the assembly opted for a more diplomatic approach. Still, Stockholm could claim a win as the revised text confirmed that the covenant applied fully to the conflict, urging members not to accept any changes to the 1931 situation, much to Japan's dismay. Before adjourning, Sweden gained a position on a 19-member committee tasked with reporting on the conflict, thus becoming involved in the Lytton Commission. Japan reacted angrily to the criticism, referring to the collective of smaller nations as small stateside, accusing them of being out of touch with realities in Asia. Some in Japanese media labeled them hardliners or from the theory faction. Interestingly, this broad criticism shielded Sweden from being specifically targeted for its strong stance. Still, following the assembly, an armed guard was occasionally placed outside the Swedish legation in Tokyo. On the Chinese side, Sweden received thanks from figures like Wang Xiaolai, who led the nationwide anti-Japanese trade boycott, which actually helped Swedish exporters face less competition in China. After hostilities ceased in March 1932, Sweden resumed arms exports to Chiang Kai-shek, a move that provoked no protest from Japan but certainly strained relations. Nevertheless, Stockholm sought to maintain an image of impartiality, standing apart from both sides in the conflict. Throughout the remainder of the year, the world waited for the Lytton Report, while public opinion remained divided at home. The strongest advocate for the League was Östen Undén, who tirelessly spoke across Sweden in support of internationalism. More importantly, after the Social Democrats won the elections in September, Sweden formed a new government. Per Albin Hansson took charge of the cabinet, appointing Rickard Sandler as the foreign minister. Unlike Baron Fredrik Remmel, Sandler was a dynamic politician with a respected role in his party. With his leadership, Swedish efforts in Geneva would continue without interruption once the eagerly awaited report was released. In the autumn, the council reconvened. On December 6th, the Extraordinary Assembly resumed, and Sandler quickly positioned the new government in support of the Lytton Report, which denied the legitimacy of Manchukuo. During renewed discussions among the smaller states, Sweden even considered Article 16 of the Covenant regarding sanctions, a tool that had never been employed before. However, this effort faced pushback from the Netherlands and, for the first time, from Switzerland. Fortunately, Sweden had the backing of Spain and Czechoslovakia, represented by Salvador Madariaga and Eduard Benes, respectively. For Undén, it was clear that world peace was indivisible. He asserted that unilateral military actions, including those in the Far East, needed to face consequences. The League, he argued, must uphold international law. To him, Sweden's primary defense was rooted in Geneva. After extensive discussion, Sweden, Spain, Czechoslovakia, and Ireland crafted a resolution condemning the Japanese military presence and advocating for a non-recognition stance towards the fabricated state of Manchukuo. At this crucial moment, the League's Secretary General, Sir Eric Drummond, intervened and insisted that the draft be withdrawn. He favored appeasing Japan, fearing that a strong condemnation might drive Japan out of the League. Although the draft remained intact, it ultimately lost in the final vote on December 9th to a more tempered resolution that referred the issue to the Lytton Report and the 19-member committee, which added further delays. Japanese media hailed this initial outcome as a triumph for Japan's chief diplomat, Matsuoka Yosuke, over the narrow-mindedness of the smaller nations. By then, the phrase small states had taken on a negative connotation in Japan, with its members often portrayed in a belittling light. A relevant cartoon published in the Yomiuri Shimbun on December 10th depicted Matsuoka tossing around a representative of a small state, resembling Östen Undén, who had dared to challenge Japan with the initial resolution text. However, this fleeting triumph was soon overshadowed. As the 19-member committee broke for the Christmas and New Year holidays, Sandler and Undén were approached by Japanese officials seeking to make one final push to sway Sweden to their side. Anticipating tense discussions, top diplomats in Stockholm opted for a strategy of fractioning the conflict into two distinct issues, one involving Sweden's relations with Far Eastern countries, and the other focusing on the conflict between the League of Nations and Japan. For the first issue, they would assert Sweden's impartiality, maintaining equal standing with both Japan and China. In contrast, regarding the League, Sweden as a loyal member had to fully support the covenant. This approach was a clever mix of demonstrating neutrality while standing in solidarity. Japan, in turn, maximized its diplomatic efforts. In Stockholm, Ambassador Mushakoji met with Foreign Minister Sandler twice, once on December 13th and again on January 10th. Meanwhile, on December 18th, Matsuoka passionately urged Undén in Geneva to reconsider his position. Yet, both attempts were fruitless. Even when Matsuoka suggested that Japan might leave the League, endangering Undén's cherished world peace initiative, the Swede refused to modify his stance. Mushakoji expressed his exasperation with his discussions with Sandler, describing them as a meeting between someone pragmatic and grounded in reality, and a stickler for formalities. As late as February 1, 1933, there was still no agreement within the 19-member committee on how to break the deadlock. Sweden and the other more progressive members proposed an arms embargo against Japan and even considered recalling all foreign diplomats from Tokyo. Although the great powers remained indecisive, a turning point was approaching. After another military action by Japan in early 1933, this time in Rehe, south of Mukden, London also crossed a line. Within days, the British representative changed course, showing support for the Lytton recommendations. The committee was finally able to present a report critical of Japan, which was officially adopted by the League in an assembly vote on February 24, despite fierce pushback from Matsuoka. The vote result stood at 42-1. The Japanese delegation left the auditorium and a month later left the League. After 1.5 years of peace efforts, it was over. In the weeks that followed the outcome in Geneva, the British government imposed a temporary arms embargo on Japan and China. A British proposal for Sweden to join this embargo was swiftly rejected by Undén, who stated that an embargo should only target the aggressor. Swedish arms exports to China could now be justified as an act of collective security. London quickly lifted its embargoes, but to the disappointment of the idealists in the League and the frustration of China, no new sanctions were imposed on Japan. While Japan lost face in international diplomacy, it won in the great power game. Manchukuo, Japan's first satellite state, was now a reality. Following the vote on the Lytton Report and Tokyo's withdrawal from the League, the internationalists held on to their confidence for a time. Many believed Japan would soon face an economic collapse due to escalating military spending. On the conservative front, opponents of the League were quick to remind the public of their stance. Geneva favors those who look after themselves. In a twist of irony, the Nya Dagligt Allehanda expressed relief at the existence of the League of Nations, noting it would pass well-crafted resolutions whenever Sweden's independence was threatened. Early parliamentary debates in 1933 were less heated, largely because most members of the major parties stayed away from speaking. The ultra-leftists were the most vocal, cynically asserting that the League and Japan were in cahoots. Despite the disillusionment, Parliament voted against Sweden's withdrawal from the League, arguing that leaving would only embolden Japan and other states with revisionist ambitions. In 1935, the Swedish Defense Committee released a report after 5 years of inquiry and discussion. Comprised of members from all major political parties, the committee had diplomat Erik Boheman write the section on Sweden's international environment. He noted the League of Nations' failure in both Manchuria and the Chaco War. He identified Japan's ongoing military expansion in the East as a threat to world peace. Following this, Sweden made no further calls for League sanctions against Japan. The unsuccessful economic blockade against Italy in 1936 dashed any remaining hopes for such actions. The situation worsened in December when Japan unexpectedly allied with Germany through the Anti-Comintern Pact, leading to a decidedly bleak outlook in the international press. Only the staunchly anti-League conservative newspapers regarded the agreement as a positive step against Bolshevism. Meanwhile, Japan showed an increased interest in the Baltic region during the mid-1930s, viewing it as a front in the fight against world communism. In 1935, Onodera Makoto, a military attaché who would later play a significant role in Sweden during the war, was assigned to Riga, and in 1936, Japan opened a new legation in Helsinki. Foreign Minister Sandler occasionally mentioned Japan in his speeches, expressing optimism about its potential return to the League of Nations in 1934, but becoming more pessimistic in May 1935 when he cautioned that tensions in East Asia could lead to another world war. He criticized Japan's rearmament and accused its diplomacy of encouraging Germany's reckless actions. Overall, Sweden avoided new initiatives regarding Manchuria, effectively abdicating its foreign policy responsibilities to Geneva. This passive approach ensured that Sweden would not disturb the existing status quo. When Belgium inquired about Western interests in Manchukuo and implicitly suggested recognizing the puppet state, Sweden replied that it could not pursue an independent foreign policy and must adhere to the League's recommendations. In 1933, Musa Koji became the ambassador to Turkey, and the very next year, he was reassigned to Berlin. In Stockholm, he was replaced by the ultranationalist Shiratori Toshio, a man of a completely different nature. Known for his striking statements at Gaimusho press conferences, Shiratori saw his posting to Sweden as a step down. Despite being a diplomat, he maintained close ties with the Japanese military, often making remarks that lacked the usual diplomatic tact. Decision-makers in Tokyo likely viewed his appointment as a way to eliminate a disruptive figure while also providing a loud advocate for Japan's interests in Stockholm. Shiratori wasted no time publishing an article in the 1934 yearbook of the Swedish-Japanese Association. In this piece, titled The Reawakening of Japan, he argued that public sentiment in Japan was uniting around the emperor and moving away from parliamentary parties, favoring a robust foreign policy. He proclaimed the end of an era defined by mindless imitation and Western influence. History, however, would not be kind to his assertions, as even during the Pacific War, public opinion did not completely abandon political parties, with parliamentary elections in 1942 unexpectedly bolstering many anti-militarist candidates, despite a strong governmental push for a one-party system. Nevertheless, Shiratori's article marked a significant shift for the usually neutral yearbooks, which typically focused on Japanese art and culture. He was intent on discussing global politics, rather than getting caught up in minor disputes over porcelain tariffs. He kept a close eye on developments in the Soviet Union and made trips to Berlin to engage in discussions that might have set the stage for the Anti-Comintern Pact. In 1936, he was recalled and soon became Japan's ambassador to Italy. The diplomatic dispute in Geneva was a lengthy and taxing process. When the League finally closed the case on Japan without imposing any sanctions, the international community, particularly Sweden, was left with mixed emotions. They had achieved only a symbolic moral victory at the League, but it came at what cost? Would Japan's disappointment with Sweden's role as a leading voice among smaller nations in Geneva affect their cultural exchanges and the far more crucial trade relations? Surprisingly, the answer is a clear no. Despite what happened at Geneva, the trade relationship stayed steady. In the early 1930s, Swedish representatives often emphasized that their nation had no special interests in the Far East. There were no Swedish colonies, no spheres of influence, and no military bases in that area. However, Sweden did have interests in East Asia, not just in Japan, but also in China. For example, Sweden had guaranteed the territorial integrity of the Chinese Republic and supported the open door policy, which stemmed from its ratification of the Nine-Power Treaty in 1922. Swedish citizens, like those from other colonial powers, still had extraterritorial rights in China, putting Sweden in a group of foreign nations that protected their privileges in treaty ports such as Canton and Tientsin. Most of the Swedish business community in China was located in Shanghai, where Sweden had a consulate general that was quite significant, even more so than its legation in Peking. While Japan had become Sweden's largest export market in the East, the volume of trade was quite modest. In fact, Sweden was Japan's primary market in Scandinavia, but it was negligible compared to much larger trade partners like the United States and China. The trade balance in the 1930s remained consistent with previous decades. Sweden exported more to Japan than it imported, resulting in a trade surplus, yet the levels were relatively low. Exports made up only about 1% of the total national export value. Trade had declined in the previous decade and fell even more after the Great Depression of 1929. It wasn't until the early 1930s that imports from Japan began to rise again, albeit from a low baseline. By 1931, trade with Japan was hardly a notable part of Swedish foreign commerce. Nonetheless, business circles in Stockholm and Gothenburg were optimistic about trade with East Asia. Japan's industry was rapidly advancing, and the large populations in China and Japan represented a significant market of potential consumers. Analysts believed living standards in East Asia would improve, and reality would eventually exceed their highest hopes. In the 1930s, Japan emerged as a hungry nation, challenging the established Western world with its lower production costs. The Japanese economy had bounced back rapidly from the Depression and was entering a period of significant transformation. Europe was flooded with affordable goods labeled "Made in Japan," including textiles, rubber boots, and toys. Japan was also undergoing a fundamental shift. Factors like military expansion and the global arms race fueled the rise of a modern heavy industry. This shift created a strong demand for advanced technology from abroad, leading to increased imports of modern machinery from various Western nations. However, European and American public opinion reacted strongly against what they perceived as the economic yellow peril. Interestingly, it seemed that peaceful commercial competition stirred up more animosity in the West than any military actions Japan took during the Manchurian Crisis. Japan's economic push did not breach international law, but it did pose a threat to domestic employment. Commerce with the Far East was primarily managed by trading houses that served as intermediaries, their local expertise and knowledge highly sought after by export firms new to the culturally distinct Asian markets. The three largest Swedish trading firms in Japan were Gedelius, J.A. Kjellberg and Sons, and Carl Ekman and Company. An exception was Svenska Kullerfabriken, which effectively sold its products directly in East Asia. The superior quality of its ball bearings led to a steady demand, particularly from Japan's growing industrial economy. Other common Swedish exports included iron, steel, paper, pulp, and various machines such as turbines and pumps. These sophisticated products were particularly desirable in Japan's high-end manufacturing sector, where local quality often fell short or technological knowledge had not yet developed. On the import side, Sweden primarily sourced tea, soybeans, and other colonial goods from East Asia. With few exceptions such as soybeans and tea, these were considered rare items, not aimed at the mass market. The manufacturing industries in China and Japan hadn't yet reached a scale that would allow for significant intercontinental exports, and shipping costs were still too high for that to happen. This growth would only take place in the latter half of the century. In the 1930s, East Asia was primarily importing more from Sweden than it was exporting. This explains why Sweden's trade surplus with Japan was about 3 times greater, and the gap with China was even wider, with exports in 1934 being 14 times more valuable than imports. Many of these goods were shipped by specialized companies, notably the Svenska Ostasiatiska Companiet, or the Swedish East Asian Company. Established in Gothenburg in 1907, the company had expanded over 2 decades to operate a fleet of 9 modern motor vessels and 7 steamers, making regular trips to India and Southeast Asia, as well as to Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Yokohama 3 times monthly, collaborating with both a Danish and a Norwegian firm. Its primary competitor was the Japanese shipping company Nihon Yusen KK, a particularly contentious area of trade for Sweden, especially given the ongoing crisis in Geneva, was its role in arms dealing. In a parliamentary speech in 1933, Communist MP Hilding Hagberg claimed that Sweden was among the nations exporting arms to Japan, but this was incorrect. Swedish arms were actually sold to China, which had no relation to the Manchurian crisis. The arms manufacturer AB Bofors had been active in Northeast Asia since 1916, when it assisted local dictator Chang Tso-lin in building up a weapons arsenal. At one point, his factory was the largest in China. Swedish arms were supplied to various competing warlords, but by the late 1920s, the Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek, had unified the nation. The Swedish authorities then advised Bofors and another company, AB Nobelkrut, to engage solely with the Chinese central government. According to statistics from the League of Nations, Sweden ranked as the world's fifth largest arms dealer in 1930, behind Great Britain, France, the United States, and Czechoslovakia. In contrast, Japan was largely self-sufficient in arms and ammunition, leading to a minimal demand for Bofors products. However, SKF and trading houses provided ball bearings to Japan, which had applications in civilian industries, as well as in the manufacture of tanks, cannons, and weapons, thereby contributing to Japan's war production. The sale of arms has always stirred controversy in Swedish politics. It faced condemnation not just from communists, but also from Christian pacifists and left-wing socialists. These groups accused the government of backing Generalissimo Chiang, who was labeled as a ruthless oppressor of Chinese workers. However, this criticism waned after Japan invaded Manchuria, and as Tokyo moved closer to Europe's right-wing dictatorships, it eventually faded away entirely. On the conservative front, the morally questionable trade was justified with the reasoning that Sweden's small defense industry needed to cater to a larger market to survive. The years between 1933 and 1937 brought a temporary calm to Swedish-Japanese relations. Although there were signs of détente, the unresolved situation in Manchuria still loomed over their interactions. Japan emerged as a new focal point in national discussions, viewed as a potential economic threat to Swedish industries. The narrative developed that Japan was aggressively pursuing not just military, but also economic dominance. Affordable goods from the East were suddenly seen as an invasion of Western markets. While the crisis in Manchuria had felt distant, the influx of Japanese exports was perceived as an immediate danger. This concern resonated among both entrepreneurs affected by Japanese competition and the labor movement, who feared foul competition from low-wage workers. In the 1930s, the shadow of mass unemployment was ever present. The discussions were highly charged emotionally. Yet, there were also business leaders and economists who cautioned against the panic and argued that the perceived threat was greatly overstated. The debate reached its peak around 1933 and 1934 before gradually subsiding. Critics of Japan railed against the dumping of inexpensive Japanese products. They argued that Japan's economic achievements could only be attributed to unfair trade practices. Imperialist Japan needed more markets and took advantage of its workers, forcing them into poor working conditions and meager wages in sweatshops. Harrowing accounts, such as Freda Utley's Japan's Feet of Clay, a Marxist residing in the Soviet Union, were frequently cited. The unspoken conclusion was that products made in Japan should be boycotted. The impact on Japanese workers was not considered, nor was there any thought given to engaging in discussions with Japanese trade unions to promote international solidarity. Swedish business leaders in Tokyo and Osaka had a contrasting perspective on the so-called economic yellow peril. They were acutely aware that Sweden maintained a significant trade surplus with Japan and could face retaliation, like increased porcelain tariffs. Professor Bertil Ohlin, a prominent economist, supported the idea that the wages of Oriental workers needed context since living costs in Japan were quite low. Additionally, workers had various important benefits that contributed to a clearer understanding of the social conditions. Moreover, Japan exported a smaller proportion of its production compared to Sweden. Olin argued that Japan's successes stemmed not from low wages, but from the devaluation of the yen in December 1931. He also noted that Japanese companies had embraced new technologies and improved their productivity. Although the atmosphere for diplomacy and trade with Japan was tense, Both sectors actually began to flourish again around the mid-decade. Swedish trade statistics show that exports to Japan rose significantly between 1931 and 1935, increasing from about 12.8 million CK to nearly 21.9 million CK. Imports also more than doubled, going from approximately 3.6 million CK to about 8.9 million CK, which, as mentioned, triggered pushback from various interest groups within Sweden. In the protectionist climate of the 1930s, discussions in both Stockholm and Tokyo focused on imposing tariff barriers and other measures to artificially reduce real or perceived trade deficits. For instance, on January 8, 1935, Fujiwara Ginjiro, head of the large paper firm Oji Seishi and president of the Japanese-Swedish Society, delivered a speech where he highlighted that Swedish businesses thrived in Japan, while Japanese exporters faced numerous challenges in Sweden. To foster more balanced trade relations and address the growing Swedish trade surplus, he proposed that Stockholm commit to purchasing more Japanese goods. Envoy Hultman, present in the audience, immediately responded that Sweden did nothing to prevent Japanese firms from entering the Swedish market. On the other hand, he contended that no trade barriers existed. Sweden's envoy pointed to a lack of Japanese interest in Sweden as a market for its exports as the reason for the trade deficit. Whether that critique was justified is hard to determine, but Swedish companies and export-driven firms like SKF worried that Japanese frustration over the trade imbalance could lead to retaliation against their products or worsen Sweden's relations with its Japanese counterparts. For example, Fujiwara, who was not only the president of the Japanese-Swedish Society, but also the primary supporter of a distinctive Japanese tea house opened in Stockholm in October 1935, was a key figure in these discussions. Consequently, the head of SKF, Gösta Gustan, penned a private letter to reassure Fujiwara and even inquired among Swedish colleagues about providing better conditions for Japanese goods. When the debate arose against Japanese imports due to concerns about labor exploitation, Gustan was among those who firmly repudiated such claims, emphasizing the differences in living costs and the presence of social welfare programs. He feared that any import restrictions his country might impose could provoke a backlash from Japan. He also advocated for reducing Swedish tariffs to ease the sale of East Asian products, hoping it would inspire the Japanese parliament to adopt a similar stance and avoid drifting into protectionism. Ultimately, Gustan's advocacy did not result in a significant increase in imports, but it wasn't a significant concern as trade remained steady. New tariffs from Japan in the mid-1930s did not adversely affect Swedish exports, and Sweden's increase in import duties on porcelain in 1934 was tolerated by Japanese firms since it wasn't aimed solely at them. Japan remained aware of the broader context. Sweden was one of the last liberal strongholds in a world leaning toward economic nationalism. Trade statistics reflected this reality. Between 1936 and 1937, the value of Swedish exports doubled once more. Additionally, Swedish businesses faced a pressing question: how to approach Manchukuo. Clearly, the Swedish government would never recognize it as a legitimate state, neither legally nor in practice. However, what implications would this stance have for business ties in the region? With 30 million people, Manchukuo was too significant to disregard as a potential market. 15% of customs revenue from China stemmed from this source. But even more crucial was the issue of soybean oil. Manchurian soybeans had grown into a lucrative market with the potential to play a vital role in Sweden's food security, something that diplomats in the Japanese Empire keenly acknowledged and highlighted. In early March 1937, Gustan, who also held the position of Swedish consul in Yokohama, communicated with the new envoy to Japan, Widar Bage, in 2 letters regarding the status of soybean exports from Manchukuo. Shipments from Dairen, destined for Stockholm, had reached record levels the previous year, totaling 136,456 tons. The trade was valued at CK 20 million. In contrast, total imports from Japan that year were only half that figure, while overall imports from China amounted to CK 28 million. Even total imports from Japan alone were valued at just CK 15.6 million. When looking at total trade volume, Manchukuo's soybeans represented approximately 1.2% of all Swedish imports in 1936. This was a highly sought-after commodity. While shipments from Manchukuo didn't sustain the Swedish economy, soybeans had become a significant factor in Swedish trade and diplomacy. Guston's thorough insights are noteworthy in this context. It's revealing that he deemed the topic important enough to warrant a detailed report to his superior. Officially, Sweden regarded Manchurian soybeans merely as a product of China, which is why they didn't appear in trade statistics with Japan. Similarly, from the Japanese perspective, soybeans were not viewed as a Japanese export, but rather from the independent state of Manchukuo. Yet, diplomats saw things differently. It was evident that Sweden's imports from Manchukuo relied on Tokyo's willingness to facilitate these exports, and this trade was effectively part of Sweden's economic ties with Japan. Guston specifically categorized exports from Manchukuo to Sweden under trade relations between Sweden and the Japanese Empire. As consul, he believed this context should be considered during negotiations with Japanese officials. He suggested that acknowledging this trade volume could help Sweden secure better export conditions with Manchukuo, or at least compete on equal footing with Germany, which had entered a trade agreement with Manchukuo in April 1936. Given the unofficial perspective on the size of the Japanese Empire, trade seemed to favor it. Guston calculated in that same letter that Sweden faced a trade deficit with the Japanese Empire amounting to yen 2.6 million. For him, the key issue wasn't whether to recognize Manchukuo. The political climate rendered that irrelevant. Instead, the focus was on how to leverage these figures to improve trade terms. He believed strongly in the importance of protecting our interests in this territory as a future valuable export market, highlighting that the Manchukuo authorities recognized the need to limit discussions strictly to trade matters, and suggesting that Germany's unsatisfactory experience with its trade deal might open the door for Sweden as a significant soybean buyer, a detail that hadn't been previously acknowledged. Guston consistently stressed the significance of Manchukuo. In later correspondence, he urged investigating options for direct Swedish investments and partnerships with Japanese companies known for setting up factories or branch offices there. These assertions were notably bold for a Swedish official, yet they reflected his personality and the mission he pursued, enhancing trade relations with East Asia. As the SKF manager, Guston was well integrated into the Japanese business landscape and had a keen perception of local dynamics. Thus, he emerged as an idealistic international businessman rather than a political envoy from Sweden. International politics merely defined the framework within which he and the Swedish business sector operated. In essence, Swedish businesses like Guston viewed Japan favorably, seeing Manchukuo not as a challenge to international law or diplomatic relations, but as an opportunity to advance national interests through trade. Guston's opinions mirrored a broader trend in the late 1930s, where trade and diplomacy were increasingly entwined. As longtime trade partners began isolating themselves behind tariffs and other trade restrictions, Sweden found it necessary to rethink its trade policy and seek out new markets. Official diplomatic channels became increasingly crucial in this effort. Foreign Minister Sandler remarked that our legations have been converted into business agencies, acknowledging that the social democratic government supported this push for export growth. He believed that establishing stable conditions for Sweden's export sector should be a primary focus of the country's foreign policy. In relation to countries like Japan, this highlighted a significant dilemma between financial gains, such as full employment and improved living standards for the Swedish people, and moral principles, like maintaining a foreign policy in line with international law. This dilemma became more pressing as living conditions both in Sweden and abroad continued to decline. Sandler sought to emphasize the essential role of foreign trade in the national economy. With a hopeful perspective towards idealism, he seemed to cling to the belief that trade could foster confidence among nations. We must recognize that as long as Bolshevik, Nazi, and fascist dictatorships coexist with democratic states, all nations need to find common ground, address economic challenges, and sustain essential economic ties. We shouldn't sever the potential for peaceful coexistence with states that have different political systems simply due to our strong opinions about their nature. This statement starkly contrasted with many in the left wing of his party, who criticized trade that didn't align with their political beliefs. Additionally, the authority of the League of Nations was diminishing. The 1932 Disarmament Conference had floundered due to insurmountable disputes among the great powers. By 1935, the League braced for a new crisis following Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, and the failure of sanctions led Sweden and other smaller nations to reconsider the League's capacity to ensure collective security, prompting a return to traditional policies. Elia Löfgren's speech in Geneva in 1932 had indeed been prophetic. In the summer of 1937, a disillusioned Swedish government began to reassess the merits of a genuine neutrality policy. Global peace was threatened by an increasing number of conflicts, and Geneva appeared ineffective. The aggressive advance of Japan's Kanto army into China, which led to the establishment of the artificial state of Manchukuo, and a violent conflict that was essentially a war, posed a serious challenge to the international community. This marked the first time Sweden and Japan found themselves on opposing sides in a diplomatic struggle affecting their core interests. In Stockholm, it took months for a consensus to form regarding the crisis. When the decision was made to firmly support the principles of the League of Nations, Sweden dispatched its best diplomats to Geneva to ardently defend a rules-based international order and the noble ideals of collective security. For a moment, smaller nations like Sweden and Czechoslovakia took the lead in League actions against an aggressor state, but this did not garner much enthusiasm from the great powers. Britain and France, with their colonies in the east, were unwilling to jeopardize relations with the Japanese Empire, which also acted as a counterbalance to Chinese nationalism and Soviet influence. However, for Sweden and other advocates of active internationalism, the situation was perceived differently. The long-awaited disarmament conference of the League began its sessions in early 1932, highlighting the crucial link between disarmament and effective security guarantees. The Swedish government saw disarmament as the most pressing issue of their time. If the League couldn't uphold collective security during this pivotal moment, the vision of a peaceful world would have to be postponed for another generation. So, Stockholm took the calculated risk of alienating Japan for the strength of the League and, ultimately, for its own domestic security. Unfortunately, this strategy backfired. Japan exited the League, Manchukuo was established as an undeniable reality, collective security suffered significant damage, and Sweden's reputation in Japan declined to that of an unpleasant entity that dared to challenge Asia's great power. Nonetheless, there was no impact on the commercial relationships between the two nations. Swedish business dealings with Japan continued unaffected, and trade significantly increased until 1937. Swedish trade with Manchuria also remained stable. In fact, the highly profitable trade with Manchukuo soybeans expanded significantly, benefiting not just the businesses involved but also Sweden overall, as it gained access to a vital food source for the nutrition-depleted years ahead. The early worries about potential Japanese reprisals for Sweden's political stance regarding its actions in China proved to be unfounded. Japan chose not to retaliate against Sweden for its global position. By 1937, the core of Swedish-Japanese relations stayed intact. Despite any objections, the two countries continued their trade.